Our speaker today, we've had a couple times in the past. He did so we have the DVD of this, History of the End of the World, Jonathan Kirsch's book, which we're also carrying here, which will get a nice boost in 2012, right? When the world is going to come to another end. It's always good for authors who write about the end of the world that it comes every 5 or 6 years. You get a nice little boost for your books. He's probably most famous for writing The Harlot by the Side of the Road. I saw her at the 210 freeway in the exit. She had a little sign, "I'm the harlot by the side of the," yeah. These are forbidden tales of the Bible. These are the stories that, you know, when you actually read it as an adult, you go, I can't believe this is in that book. That you don't hear those in Sunday school. After 9/11, he wrote God Against the Gods, the history of the war between monotheism and polytheism, and how religion and politics have always been deeply intertwined, and we are greatly honored today. His book just came out this last week, and he's just starting his book tour, so we're so honored to have him. His book is called The Grand Inquisitor's Manual, A History of Terror in the Name of God. We have all these books here, by the way, so right after his talk and a short Q&A, he'll stick around for a book signing. I started reading it last night. Jonathan, it's another wonderful read. He's most of you know Jonathan from the LA Times. He writes book reviews and commentaries for the Times. His father was involved in that. His son is also reviewing for the Times, and he also does commentary, book commentary and cultural commentary for KCRW and KPCC here in Pasadena. And his day job, I guess, is property law, copyright law, and issues on intellectual property and so forth. So without further ado, please help me welcome Jonathan Kirsch. Okay, here you go.
Great, thank you.
And I'll get all this stuff.
Thank you, Michael. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here at the Skeptics. It's always the premier venue for many authors, and especially for this author. It's a high point of my touring year, and I'm delighted to be with you. And it's a very fresh new book for me, so I'm rolling it out in front of you. I talked about it yesterday for the first time, but I put some special material together for the Skeptics because the subject of my book, The Inquisition, has a very pointed relationship with the history of the scientific enterprise, because perhaps its single most famous victim was Galileo, and we'll touch upon his fate before the Inquisition. My book, as you've heard, is about the Inquisition, but it is not just about a distant point in history. It is a subject that I hope you will agree is a subject full of shock. It's full of heartbreak. There are a few surprises. You may think you know a lot about the Inquisition, but there are some things you may not know, and I'll hope to share a few of them with you today. To quote a beloved Monty Python gag line, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. But when the Grand Inquisitor happens to turn up again and again throughout history, and he always has more than a few catch-22s in tow, and it's really, I think you will agree, no joke. Countless thousands and tens of thousands of flesh and blood, men, women, and children, human beings like ourselves, have been the real-life victims of the historical Inquisition. And I will argue to you today, as I argue in my book, that the long shadow of the Inquisition falls across the world in which we live. I'm going to begin with a quote from a wonderful historian named Henry Charles Lee, who was to the history of the Inquisition what Edward Gibbon was to the history of ancient Rome. Satan might well smile at the tribute to his power in the endless smoke of the Holocaust, which bore witness to the triumph of the Almighty, referring to the flames at which accused heretics were burned by the Inquisition. Now, Henry Lee lived and worked and wrote before the word Holocaust took on its current meaning, but I make the point in my book, and I make it here today, that those hooded friar inquisitors of the distant Middle Ages who, in a real sense, drafted the blueprints for the phenomena in history that we know as the Holocaust, for the Stalinist era in Russia, and for many other of the appalling excesses of the 20th century, including the so-called War on Terror. What I call in my book the inquisitorial toolbox, which is a set of ideas and values, but also a set of real, palpable, physical, mechanical tools of torture. The inquisitorial toolbox has been cracked open and put to use again and again throughout history in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, during the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II, during the Hollywood blacklist, and at Abu Ghraib. These similarities are so striking that in 1937, when the historian Cecil Roth published a book called The Spanish Inquisition, he felt that it was necessary to include a preface to warn his readers that his book was not a satire on current events, what was happening in Russia and Germany in 1937, the Moscow show trials and the horrors of the Nazi regime, but in fact was a work of history. The ultimate irony of the Inquisition, for example, is that one of those tools in the inquisitorial toolkit, which they called the ordeal by water, has been used at Abu Ghraib. It's been used in the secret prisons of the CIA, although nowadays its defenders like to call it waterboarding, as if it were a kind of sport rather than an instrument of torture. It is exactly at this point that we bump into one of the values and approaches that the Inquisition bestowed upon history. The Inquisitors never wanted to call anything by its rightful name, and neither does our American president. What is indisputably a form of torture is known by the CIA euphemism harsh interrogation techniques. We would call it torture. In that sense, what George Orwell called newspeak, torturing language to mean something different than it appears to mean, war is peace, love is hate, is itself an invention of the Inquisition, which insisted on calling torture judicium secularum, secular justice, and referred to the burning of a man or a woman to death on charges of heresy as an auto de fe, an act of faith. What is this Inquisition that I'm talking about? The Inquisition is a blueprint for the kind of absolute totalitarianism and state terror that has come to be familiar to us because of the history of the 20th century, but actually begins in the High Middle Ages. The Inquisition was an international secret police. At certain times it had as its chief executive officer a single individual known as a Grand Inquisitor, and thus the title of my book, an individual seated at the Vatican in some periods of history, at Madrid for the Spanish Inquisition. But the Inquisition itself was a bureaucracy. It's what we would readily recognize as a bureaucracy. It was staffed not only with friar inquisitors, the actual shock troops of the Inquisition, members of the Franciscan and Dominican orders, but also bailiffs, clerks, scriveners, notaries, attorneys, constables, jailers, and of course, on staff, on salary, torturers and executioners. The Inquisition, I think quite shockingly, but it's a trait of the Inquisition that reveals what control freaks they were, had the medieval equivalent of what we would today call a database. They recorded meticulously, of course by hand on paper, not through any other means, the names and whereabouts and identities, the characteristics of thousands, countless thousands of individuals who fell under suspicion of heresy. And these records were copied and distributed all over the world, with the result that if you were lucky enough to escape the Inquisition in one locality, you would be at distinct risk of falling into the hands of the Inquisition as it operated in some other locality. The Inquisition was global in scale. It operated throughout Europe at various points in history. primarily in southern France, Spain, and Italy, but in other locations as well. And it followed European colonization, Spanish colonization, to the New World and to the Indian subcontinent, with the result that there were inquisitorial tribunals at work burning heretics, accused heretics, in Goa, in Mexico City, all over South America. In fact, the first Jews to reach North America and the settlement that became the United States of America were Jews who had escaped from the Inquisition in Spain by going to Brazil. And when they were followed by the Inquisition to Brazil, they escaped once again to North America. As I've pointed out, there's nothing that quite captures the authoritarian cast of mind of the Inquisition as its a passion for making and keeping records. We know, thanks to the records kept by the inquisitors themselves, exactly how much money to the cent was spent to buy the kindling and firewood to burn an accused heretic to death. We know exactly how much fluid was poured down to the throat of a victim of the ordeal by water, the medieval version of waterboarding. It was 5 liters for the ordinary suspect, 10 liters in extraordinary circumstances. We know that the first degree of torture, and by the way, in its passion for control, the Inquisition measured out torture in 5 degrees. And when we use the phrase giving someone the 3rd degree, which makes us think of back rooms in police stations with a swinging lamp and somebody being worked over, the 3rd degree was in fact a phrase coined and used by the Inquisition to describe one of the 5 degrees of torture. The 1st degree of torture was simply to show the victim the instruments. Because the Inquisition was a machinery based on terror. It was based on fear. And the minds that dreamed up the Inquisition understood the power of fear and understood that for many people, perhaps most people, all it took was the sight of the torture chamber to bring them to confession. By the way, you might be interested to know that the method by which torture was measured out was a very pious one. For example, the 2nd degree of torture was measured by the amount of time it took the inquisitor to recite an Ave Maria or a Pater Noster. With the 3rd degree, it began in earnest. Now, I want to pause and talk briefly about what supposed crime, the Inquisition was organized to prosecute, to detect, and punish. I'm very careful in my book never to call anyone a heretic, because heresy is always and only in the eye of the beholder. There is not a crime that can be defined in any meaningful way. Heresy, as perhaps you already know, I've actually mentioned it to you before on other occasions. Heresy derives from the Greek word that simply means choice. And in the eyes of the medieval Roman Catholic Church, as in the mind of Sarah Palin, choice is a dangerous thing. There are people who are fearful of giving you a choice because you might choose the wrong thing. Heresy was nothing more and nothing less than the crime of holding a thought that the church deemed to be an impermissible thought. To give you a concrete example from history, in the 13th century, and not before, the Pope decided that the service of the communion, the taking of the wine and the wafer as part of a religious service, must be understood by the pious Christian as a miraculous event at which the bread becomes not figuratively, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally the body of the slain Christ. And the wine becomes not symbolically his blood, but literally his blood. This is a doctrine of transubstantiation. If you couldn't get your mind around that, if you insisted on looking at the Eucharist as a symbolic ritual rather than a literal miracle, you held an impermissible thought, and that was the kind of heresy that the Inquisition was called into existence to punish, an impermissible thought. In that sense, the Inquisition punished what Orwell called several centuries later a thought crime. It existed only in the mind. By the time an elderly and distinguished scientist by the name of Galileo Galilei was dragged before the Inquisition, first in 1616, again in 1632, he was charged with a crime that consisted of holding the thought that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. That was the crime for which Galileo was punished. Now, as I've noted, we may be tempted to think we know a lot about the Inquisition, maybe all we want to know about the Inquisition, but I trust there are a few surprises. Here are a few of them. The Spanish Inquisition was not the Inquisition. It was only a branch operation. The Inquisition begins in southern France in the year 1233, and it remains in active operation across Europe and around the world for 600 years. The last victim of the Inquisition to be put to death for the thought crime of heresy died in 1826, 50 years after the American Revolution. And the Spanish Inquisition, the last and most active phase of the Inquisition, was not formally disbanded until 1834. Some of the more famous victims of the Inquisition include not only Galileo, who we will revisit in a few moments, but Joan of Arc, the Knights Templar, and the body count includes the countless tens of thousands of women who were charged and burned as witches on evidence that consisted of the fact that they had a facial mole or a bad temper or no husband. That was enough to get you charged with witchcraft before the Inquisition or the other tribunals that burned witches. The Inquisition put books as well as their authors on trial. The Talmud and other Jewish writings were burned by the cartload. And because the inquisitors, and this is a key point, because the inquisitors lived on the money they seized from their victims, because the fuel for the engine of persecution was the treasure seized from victims, once they ran out of living victims, they were perfectly willing to disinter the corpse of a dead heretic and put that corpse on trial and dispossess his heirs, his children and grandchildren, of their property inherited from him. These were the so-called defunct heretics, and they were punished along with the live ones. Here's a surprise for you, perhaps. The Spanish Inquisition was formally disbanded in 1834, but the Inquisition as an office of the Roman Catholic Church has never been disbanded. It's only been renamed. The office of the Vatican, which supervised the work of the Inquisition, formerly called the Holy Office of the Inquisition, was renamed in 1908 as the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and it remains in existence. The cardinal who directed its operations until 2005 is now sitting on the papal throne. He is Pope Benedict XVI. Another surprise, the Inquisition was not invented or used primarily to punish Jews. And in fact, as a technical matter, professing Jews were always beyond the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was first deployed and was primarily deployed against Christians who were deemed to be the wrong kind of Christian by the Roman Catholic Church. Its first victims were a group of dissident Christians, you might call them proto-Protestants, that we know best as Cathars. They are also called Albigensians. They had a lot of names. They were simply kind of a splinter group of Christianity that had its own rather strange and eccentric theology, but they didn't look or act much differently than other Christians. In fact, they held themselves to a much higher standard of asceticism, of self-denial, than did the priests of the Roman Catholic Church, with the result that one of the ways that the spies and informers who worked for the Inquisition could finger a Cathar was by his or her pale complexion and thin frame. In other words, if you were underfed, that was evidence that you might well be a heretic and you might well end up on the pyre. Jews only came into the crosshairs of the Inquisition in that famous and resonant year 1492, and for reasons that are related to the voyage of Columbus. The triumphant Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, had finally conquered the Iberian Peninsula, ejected the last of the Muslim kingdoms that had ruled there. One of the things they did was to send Columbus on his voyages of discovery. Another thing they did was to take some advice from the Grand Inquisitor in Spain, the famous Torquemada, to issue an edict which gave the Jewish population of Spain 90 days to convert to Catholicism or to leave. That was the choice. The problem was that any Jew, and later any Muslim, who converted to Catholicism was always under suspicion by the Inquisition that the conversion was insincere and that they were in fact secretly practicing their religion while pretending to be Christians. And it's at that point, again, by a catch-22, by going from Judaism to Christianity, one places oneself under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, and by doing so, one falls afoul of the conviction of the Inquisitor that you couldn't have been a sincere convert in the first place. And so did thousands of Jews, former Jews, converted Jews, end up in the prisons, the torture chambers, and at the pyre. Now, just as a Cathar might fall afoul of his or her pale complexion, the fact that a former Jewish woman changed her lingerie once a week on Saturday night, not an uncommon practice and certainly nothing to do with the practice of Judaism, that alone was considered evidence by the Inquisition that a former Jew, a converted Jew, was clinging to their old faith. What is perhaps the most shocking fact, maybe you won't be so shocked, but I was pretty shocked, is that even today, even after all we know, there are still apologists, defenders, and deniers of the Inquisition, rather like there is of the Holocaust. They argue that the Inquisition was never as bad as it aspired to be. They wanted to be a universal authoritarian police force, but they were never quite as well-staffed or well-funded or efficient as they wanted to be. Or they argue that everything the Inquisition did was sanctioned by law. True enough. The popes, starting with Innocent III, in fact draped the inquisitors with a whole body of canon law that permitted them and even required them to do what they did. They argue that those occasions when there was an undeniable outrage or excess, children, for example, as young as 7 could be put to torture, that these were not policies of the Inquisition, these were violations of policy by renegade inquisitors. And then there are historians, modern working historians writing today, who say that we are engaging in an erroneous retrospection, the application of our own standards on a past history when we take the jurisdiction, we take the Inquisition to task. They argue that the Inquisition, because it was a machine for which laws were prescribed, for which rules and procedures were provided, was in fact dispensing what they call legal justice. even if they are forced to concede that it failed to provide what they call moral justice, making a distinction which I would argue is really without a difference. At precisely this point, when we have to argue in 2008 about whether the Inquisition was a good thing or a bad thing, we have passed through the looking glass. And we're in that Kafkaesque world where words only mean what the speaker intends them to mean. In this case, the apologists and deniers of the Inquisition. This is what I describe as the reason why Kafka, writing in the early 20th century, is really the poet laureate of the Inquisition, because he captures the absurdity of the historical stance that we encounter at the Inquisition. You can't defend yourself against this court, is what Kafka writes in The Trial, and he could have been writing about the Inquisition. All you can do is confess. Here we bump into another irony. The Inquisition was perfectly willing to burn a man or a woman as a heretic on the flimsiest evidence or on no evidence at all, on charges that we would regard as lacking any evidentiary support at all. But they still sought what they called the queen of proofs, by which they meant the confession of the accused heretic. And that is precisely why so many victims of the Inquisition were put to torture, sanctioned by the laws that ruled the Inquisition. The whole point of torture, of course, is to compel the victim to incriminate himself or herself under threat or application of physical pain. But here is yet another level of irony and yet another shadow that the Inquisition casts into the future, into our own times. The inquisitors were very exacting torturers. They were not content with a confession. It was not enough for the accused heretic to say, "All right, I confess, I am a heretic, please stop torturing me." This was considered to be an imperfect and thus an insufficient confession. What they were required to do was to name names. And at this point enters into the history of our civilization this vile and destructive idea that it's not enough to save yourself by confessing your own guilt, real or feigned. It is necessary to denounce and betray and incriminate your spouse, your relatives, your acquaintances. And only if an accused heretic named names was the confession accepted. This, of course, comes up again throughout history at the Salem witch trials in North America, and very notably during the Hollywood blacklist era. One of the examples that I use in my book of the long shadow of the Inquisition. Now, since we're in an academic setting, this is a point I make in my book, and I'd like to share it with you now. Confession was a tricky thing in the Inquisition because all of its proceedings were entirely in secret. You were not told as an accused heretic what you were accused of believing, what you were accused of doing, or who accused you of doing it. This was all concealed from the defendant in the Inquisition proceedings. Now, this becomes especially difficult because the only defense available under the rules of law that applied to the Inquisition was to impugn the motives of the accuser by arguing that the accuser was acting out of personal enmity in an attempt to work out a personal grudge against you. And that could discredit the witness. No other defense was available. But if you didn't know who your accuser was, because that fact was withheld from you, you were essentially denied this defense altogether. However, one victim of the Spanish Inquisition managed to find a way around this. He was a professor on the faculty of the University of Salamanca. And he managed to identify his accuser by the expedient of naming every other faculty member as a personal enemy. On the assumption that one or the other of them might have been the accuser, and academic politics being what it was and is, he guessed right. A rare example. Now, this carnival of absurdity that the Inquisition constituted is recorded, as I've pointed out already, in the proceedings of the Inquisition itself, and especially in the reference works that are called Inquisitors' Manuals, after which I've titled my book. Inquisitors' Manuals were kind of standard operating procedures that were printed and circulated among working inquisitors to train them in the work they were expected to do. If you look in the Inquisitor's Manual, they will insist that the accused heretic is actually a very guileful and cunning enemy of the church, and that it takes a watchful and careful inquisitor to catch the heretic during interrogation. And so it begins to sound a little bit like an Abbott and Costello routine. An example is given in the famous Inquisitor's Manual of Bernard Guy. Do you believe in Christ, born of the Virgin, suffered, risen, and ascended to heaven? The inquisitor asks in one of these sample interrogation transcripts. And you, sir, replies the accused, do you not believe it? I believe it wholly, the inquisitor says. I believe it likewise, affirms the accused. The inquisitor is cautioned not to fall into this trap. You believe that I believe it, the inquisitor said, which is not what I asked, but whether you believe it. Now, I use this example because here again is an echo that sounds down through history. We have a transcript of Bertolt Brecht's appearance before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the era of the Hollywood blacklist. And he's asked, have you attended any communist meetings? And Brecht, who might have studied the Inquisitor's Manual, says, no, I don't think so. Well, aren't you certain? No, I am certain, yes. You are certain you have never been to a Communist Party meeting? Yes, I think so. You are certain? I think I am certain. And on that ploy, I might say, Brecht was actually thanked by the committee for being a cooperative witness and excused from further appearances. And he left the hearing room and got on a plane, flew to East Berlin, and never returned from the other side of the Iron Curtain for the rest of his life. More often, however, the real interrogation consisted, when there was disputation at all, of a kind of heads I win, tails you lose proposition, which would prevent any accused heretic from talking his or her way out of it. A sample question would be, does a woman conceive through an act of God or of man? And I should pause to point out, this is the quality of the investigation of a heretic. There is no crime that's been committed that can be proven by conventional evidence. This is a thought crime. Does a woman conceive through the act of God or the act of man? And the inquisitor is instructed that if the answer is man, a woman conceives through the act of man, the answer is heretical because it denies the power of God. But if the answer is God, then the reply is still heretical because it suggests that God has carnal relations with women. But I want to caution or remind you about something. These are funny moments in this sorry and horrifying history. But what really went on in those interrogation cells was not funny. What really happened in the interrogation cells is that a man or a woman who had been sitting in an isolation cell for weeks or months or sometimes even years was dragged into the torture chamber, panic-stricken, disoriented, friendless, fatigued, and starved, and was not engaging in elegant disputations with the Inquisitor. The transcripts of the interrogations of the Inquisition, again, preserved by the Inquisitors themselves, record for our benefit every word that was spoken in this interrogation session or the torture session. Every answer, every cry of pain was recorded, with the result that we know that what really happens in a torture chamber, and I would add it happened at Abu Ghraib surely as much as it happened during the Inquisition, is that the victim of torture begs for the opportunity to say anything that will stop the pain. The victim seeks only to find out what the torturer wants to hear and then tells him, which is why torture, any real criminologist will tell you, is a futile way to extract real evidence. Just to put it fully in the here and now, if the interrogators in the secret prisons of the CIA are really worried about imminent terrorist acts, the last way they're going to get reliable, actionable intelligence is by torture. What they'll get from torture is the answer the victim thinks his torturer wants to hear. And this is exactly what happened in the Inquisition in all of its phases. We have the transcript of a woman accused of the crime of secretly practicing Judaism after converting to Christianity. She has been put to torture, and the stenographer who is taking down her words records, "Signores, why will you not tell me what I have to say? Have I not said that I did all that the witnesses say I did? Release me, for I remember it not." That's the real voice of the Inquisition. Another tactic of the Inquisition, which has proved to be kind of an enduring favorite of authoritarians down through the ages, and is very prominent in the history of the Inquisition, is the willful slandering of one's victims, is the reduction of one's victims to the level of vermin, of demonic creatures, to deny that they are fellow human beings. And what we have learned is that this is a necessary precondition to a crime against humanity. It is necessary for the authoritarian regime, whether it's the Inquisition or Nazi Germany, to convince the man who's going to pull the lever in the gas chamber that what he's killing is not men, women, and children, but vermin or pests. And this idea begins in the Inquisition, where heretics are described in precisely that language, the same language that's used down through the ages. And as a result, for example, when persecuting the Cathars, whose real crime was that they held to a theology that was slightly different, or you might argue greatly different, than the theology of the Roman Catholic Church. That was their real crime. They were, for good measure, accused of, at their worship services, engaging in incestuous orgies at which men copulated with their daughters, mothers copulated with their sons, producing bastard infants who were brought to some subsequent worship service to be slaughtered, burned, and eaten, as if the inquisitors understood that it was not enough to burn someone alive for believing that the blood, the wine of the communion does not turn literally into the blood of Christ. You had to add something a little weightier to the accusation. By another irony of history, this horrible, stomach-turning accusation I've just given you was first recorded in history as an allegation by the Roman persecutors of Christianity against the first Christians in the first century of the Common Era. That's where that scenario comes from. By the time of the Inquisition, the Christians are now in power, and they turn it around against their imagined enemies. And down through the ages, as the Inquisition looks for new and different victims, there's a terrible sameness to this slandering of the victim. They're all accused of exactly this same pattern of sexual excess and cannibalism and child sacrifice, as if the monks sitting in their cells spent rather too much time imagining what these people did in secret. There's a way that this has imprinted itself on our language, which I will share to you as an example. The Cathars embraced a kind of a dualist theology that probably originated with a dissident Christian community in Bulgaria. And so the Cathar, one of the many names that was used to identify the Cathars in Western Europe was the French word for Bulgarian, or Bulgar, which is bulgra, and that passes into English as bugger. Now, the church taught that the Cathars engaged in every manner of sexual outrage, including anal intercourse. And so the reason today bugger as a coarse term in the English language means anal intercourse is because 800 years ago, at the beginnings of the Inquisition, that was a sexual practice attributed to the Cathars, whose theology was thought to originate in Bulgaria. That's how deeply this culture of persecution has been soaked into our civilization. I want to make the point that although I've insisted the Inquisition punished thought crimes, in fact, once it was perfected, this marvelous machinery of terror was used for other purposes as well. Joan of Arc was prosecuted by the Inquisition at Paris as a witch, or the formal charge was witchcraft, because she had championed the cause of Charles VII, who was a claimant to the French throne, and who set himself against an invading English army and their French collaborators. This was a political problem in France as to who would be the next king of France. And there was an English candidate, and there was the candidate that Joan of Arc backed. And the English prevailed upon the Inquisition at Paris to discredit Charles VII by accusing Joan of Arc, his great champion, 19-year-old woman, by the way, of being a witch. Now, she claims she heard voices from God. She identified the voices as emanating from God himself, from the Archangel Michael and from two saints, Catherine and Margaret. The Inquisitor at her trial, at the behest of the English, on trumped-up political purposes only, insisted that what she really had seen, she did in fact, they believe, hear supernatural voices, but they belonged to Satan, not to the Archangel Michael, and to Belial and Behemoth, a couple of Old Testament demons. And during the questioning, again recorded in meticulous detail, she was asked what language these voices spoke. Now, she was a poor, illiterate peasant woman, and she said they spoke French. That was the only language she understood. The Inquisitor said, "Did not Saint Margaret speak English?" And she answered, "Why should she speak English when she is not on the English side?" Which allows us to understand the real motive of that trial, which was simply a political trial. At the time of the so-called Roman Inquisition, which was the use of the Inquisition as a weapon in a religious war, but also at a deeper level, a culture war. At the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Inquisition was used to fight the influences of Protestantism in countries still under Catholic rule. We have the account of Paolo Veronese, who was brought to trial in Venice for painting a Bible scene from the Old Testament, in which he inserted as incidental figures in the background dogs, dwarfs, a fool, a parrot, men with German weapons, and a man with a bleeding nose. Now, having inserted these images into the painting, just as curiosities, was enough to bring you on trial before the Inquisition, which was at this point in history fighting a culture war. Not a war against a thought crime per se, but against a way of life. And we have the interrogation by the Inquisition of Paolo Veronese, do you know that in Germany, the site of the Protestant Reformation, and in other places infected with heresy, it is customary with various pictures full of scurrilousness and similar inventions to mock, vituperate, and scorn the things of the Holy Catholic Church in order to teach bad doctrines to foolish and ignorant people. Yes, the painter admits that is wrong, but I return to what I said, that I'm obliged to follow what my superiors do. What have your superiors done? Have they done perhaps similar things? And the painter says, Michelangelo in Rome in the Pontifical Chapel painted our Lord Jesus Christ, his mother, St. John, St. Peter, and the heavenly host. They are all represented in the nude, even the Virgin Mary, and in different poses with little reverence. But the Inquisitor it's like a dog with a bone. Do you not know that in painting the Last Judgment, in which no garments are shown, it is not necessary to paint garments, and in those figures there is nothing which is not spiritual. There are no buffoons, dogs, weapons, or men with German weapons. This is the purpose to which the Inquisition was put at that point in history. Perhaps the single most notorious episode, and maybe the one that will resonate the most here at Caltech, is the trial of Galileo Galilei by the Inquisition for the crime of entertaining the truth of the Copernican model of the universe. The Inquisition by that point had already banned outright the works of Erasmus, Machiavelli, Boccaccio, and others. Copernicus's works went on the list of banned books in 1616, and in the same year that Copernicus ended up on the index of banned books, Galileo was charged with the crime of heresy for entertaining the idea that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the sun, Galileo was advocating that the earth revolved around the sun rather than, as the Bible presumably mandated, that the sun revolves around the earth. And according to the Inquisition, Galileo thereby committed what they called the grievous heresy and blasphemy concerning the nature of God. He insisted that he could come up with what he called 1,000 proofs that the Bible account and the Copernican model could be reconciled, but proof, as we have now learned, was wholly beside the point when it came to the Inquisition. Now, I want to pause and say that he was hardly the first or the only scientist to fall afoul of the Inquisition. In 1600, far earlier advocate of the Copernican model, Giordano Bruno, had been arrested, tried, tortured, and convicted by the Inquisition and burned alive. And on the way to the stake, on the way to the auto da fe, he was fitted symbolically, but also as a final humiliation and act of torture, with a device that the inquisitors called the heretic's bridle, which was a device fashioned of metal with a long, sharp spike that pinned his jaw shut by inserting the spike beneath the jaw and lodging it in the upper palate, the soft palate. And the symbolic gesture was to say, it is the mission of the Inquisition to shut the mouths of people who speak ideas that the church does not approve. And that's how he was walked to the stake and burned alive. Now, Galileo himself was spared the worst punishments. He was not physically tortured. He was not sentenced to burning at the stake. And the reason that he was not is a very simple one. The reason is that, like any other mortal human being, when faced with these threats and risks, he did what his accusers expected him to do. Galileo confessed to the crime of heresy and recanted the idea that the earth revolved around the sun and promised not to write or teach about it in exchange for his life. That was the deal that was offered, and that was the deal that Galileo took. It's not a proud moment in the history of science, but it's a very human moment, and it's one that shows the real power and the real danger of an institution like the Inquisition. Galileo, in his 70s, a frail old man, was dressed in the plain white shirt of the penitent. He was charged, the charges were read aloud. He went down on his knees and said, "With sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies, and generally every other error, heresy, or sect, whatever contrary to the Holy Church." Now, by tradition, he was supposed to have muttered under his breath, "E pur si muevo," and yet it moves. His last whispered protest against his confession. Like so much else in the history of the Inquisition and in history generally, that's just a fabrication. That was invented about 100 years after Galileo's death in an effort to redeem him a bit and to make him out to be less of an abject coward than he appears to be in the historical record. And in fact, what he agreed to do and assured the inquisitors that he would do is, "Should I know any heretic or person suspected of heresy, I will denounce him to this holy office or to the inquisitor of the place where I may be." Now, Galileo's writings remained on the Index of Prohibited Books until 1822. In 1979, Pope John Paul II convened a commission that was meant to reinvestigate the trial of Galileo, and it deliberated for 13 years and left the conviction in place. I'm going to close my talk with just a short comment or two about how this history, which admittedly dates back in its origins to a point far distant in history, has marched forward, has been continuously present in history, and remains present in our own time. The Spanish Inquisition, as I've pointed out, would consider as evidence the fact that you changed your underwear on a Saturday night as evidence that you were a secret Jew. The Inquisition in Spain also was looking for secret Muslims, and the records of the Inquisition in Spain confirm that young men of Muslim origin who had professed to Christianity, converted to Christianity, were once observed in a public tavern eating a plate of couscous. And on that evidence, they were condemned as heretics, because surely if they continued to eat the North African dish of couscous, they must also be practicing their forbidden form of religion. That was sufficient evidence for the Inquisition. 500 years later, when the War on Terror was declared in the wake of 9/11, we learned that the FBI had prepared and was preparing to put into operation a surveillance program that would monitor the sale of couscous and other Middle Eastern foods at grocery stores in communities around America, in the confident expectation that they would thereby detect the presence of Al-Qaeda sleeper cells based on the suspicious consumption of Middle Eastern foods. That's an example of how persistent these ideas have been and how present they are in our own lives. Arthur Miller was a very interesting figure and someone I contemplate in my book for a number of reasons. He was himself a victim of the Hollywood blacklist, and he wrote about, in the play The Crucible, wrote about the Salem witch trials, which are another fingerprint of the Inquisition, using the Salem witch trials as a stand-in for the Hollywood blacklist. He wrote, not in the play, but on another occasion, "No man who lives has not got a panic button," he warned. And when it is pressed by the clean white hand of moral duty, a certain murderous train is set in motion. I'm going to close with the last paragraph of my book. The history of terror in the name of God is not confined to the medieval Inquisition or its modern successors, but it is a healthy caution to remind ourselves that the Inquisition was, and I'm quoting now, called into existence to meet a national emergency. The first inquisitors saw themselves as crusaders in a holy war against a monstrous anti-human conspiracy, and they saw their adversaries as a devoted underground elite in service to the devil. They claimed to act in the name of legal justice, and they were willing to kill them all and let God sort out the carnage. Such is the murderous engine of which Arthur Miller speaks, that is set into motion whenever we hit the panic button. If a moment of reflection on that sorry history stays our hand, we will have achieved some measure of moral justice. Thank you so much for allowing me to share these thoughts with you. Can we take any questions? Go ahead.
Before the book signing, we will do a book signing afterwards. We'll set Jonathan up over there, but he's agreed to take a few questions, so...
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, you talk about the meticulous records. I assume that they're still in existence at the Vatican and other places. Are these open to scholars and academics to...
The question is whether these meticulous records of the Inquisition are available to scholars. I want to clarify that the record keeping of the Inquisition was meticulous, but the preservation of those records over the hundreds of years that have passed has not always been so meticulous, with the result that we have very complete records for a particular diocese, a particular town. We may have no records for many others. Those records, as exist, are available to scholars and are closely studied by scholars, and it is a very lively area of scholarly enterprise. There's a continuous process of revision of the verdict on the history of the Inquisition, and those records have been very, very closely studied. Yes, sir.
Yeah. You talked about the practice of naming names, the practice of dehumanizing enemies. The way I took it, I thought you were saying that those practices were begun or initiated by the Inquisition. It seems to me that there would be nothing about those, nothing to prevent those from happening earlier in history than the Inquisition.
The Inquisition, the question is, did the excesses of the Inquisition, including the requirement for naming of names, the dehumanization of one's enemies, did they not start at earlier points in history? It is certainly true that the long history of human civilization contains heartbreaking tragedies, excesses, and outrages for as long as we have historical knowledge. It did not begin in 1233. But what began in 1233, what is new, wholly new, is the creation of this comprehensive authoritarian system sanctioned by law, resulting from a fusion of state power and church power, which allowed an entire population to be rigorously monitored and punished. That's a new phenomenon in history, and it sets the model for something that becomes very familiar in the 20th century, but had not previously been seen. Yes, sir.
Can you expand a bit more on why Galileo survived this? Because on the one hand, we have stories of people who eat cuckoos and they go on the pyre, and yet here's Galileo, who's clearly a top dog. They can make a great example of him, but he does a mere recanting, and I know that's a difficult thing to do, but given the context of the thing, he recants, and they say, okay, house arrest, you're fine.
The question is, why did Galileo survive when I'm just summarizing a very articulate question. Why did Galileo survive when others did not? Why was he given what strikes us as a light punishment? The story of Galileo, again, an episode in history that's very well documented. We have original source documents and very closely studied. There's a whole body of scholarship just about Galileo's trial. Suggests that he was under the protection of the Pope and the Cardinal who served as Grand Inquisitor for the 16 years between his first visit to the Inquisition and his second. And that when he published the book that got him in trouble, it was published under the imprimatur of the censors who enforced the will of the Inquisition. He really felt that he was under papal and inquisitorial and church protection. He was, as are so many great minds, he was kind of cantankerous and irritable and didn't like to defer to greater authorities, and he managed to alienate a lot of powerful people, including, it's been argued, the priests of the Jesuit order who were influential in the workings of the Inquisition at that point in history. And so they decided he was just a little bit too casual about the latitude he had been given by a pope and a cardinal, and that they were going to do something about it. There was a lot about his trial that makes it seem like a show trial, in the sense that the church was content to humiliate Galileo, to get him literally on his knees and to get him to recant. And having done that, they got what they wanted in this culture war. They showed their power. They showed they could intimidate a man even as great as Galileo, and they didn't need his blood. And it shows also how much had changed between 1600, when Giordano Bruno goes to the pyre, and 1632, when Galileo is allowed to spend his last years in house arrest. At the very, very back.
I'm curious to hear how you would confront the current administration's defense regarding the successful collection of data to thwart terrorist attacks. I know President Bush gave a speech where he gave very particular examples. You couldn't elaborate.
About the collection of data?
Yeah, successful collection of data from these harsh interrogations. And maybe you've seen some confront that in the past.
Well, the question is, what do we make of the assertion by President Bush that in fact what the questioner called harsh interrogation techniques and what I will call torture, in fact elicited reliable evidence? This is the game that is always played when we're talking about state secrets. That American president has asserted that there are things that he knows that we cannot know, that avoided terrorist attacks. Trust me, the intelligence was good. I'll tell you that we have been in a state of war in Iraq on intelligence that was demonstrably false and fabricated. And I'll let that speak for itself as to his reliability. I mean, really. I could not rule out, being an open-minded and rational person, that on some occasion, at some point in history, somebody was threatened with torture or tortured and gave up some fact that allowed some police agency to thwart some terrorist plot. That's plausible. But as a policy, it's flawed, and it's also, aside from being impractical, it's immoral. Yes, sir.
What are the 5 degrees?
Yeah. The 5 degrees of torture are, first of all, it's a much more complicated question than it might seem, because there were multiple tools of torture. There was the rack, the wheel, the ordeal by water. There was also a favorite, the ordeal by fire, where they would put the victim's feet, they would slather them with fat, and then stick them in a fire until they burned. There were beatings with staffs and bars. I mean, there was an endless amount of ingenuity to the tools of torture. The very first chapter of my book, the very first pages of my book, opens with the contrast between the Pietà of Michelangelo, a sublime work of the human imagination, and the instrument of torture known as la pera, the pear, invented and devised at exactly the same time. While Michelangelo was at work on the Pietà, some engineer, I have to say, was working on the pear, which was a torture device inserted in the tender orifices of the human body and then cranked open internally. There is no end to the human imagination when it is applied to torture. Now, what exactly are the 5 degrees? The first degree is showing the victim the instruments. The second degree, to put it in simple terms, is a short duration of torture. And then the third, fourth, and fifth are longer durations. Just the clock runs longer and the instruments are applied with more rigor. For example, one of the favorite tortures was to hang someone with their arms tied behind their back. This is still used in modern police techniques. And hang them so that the weight of their own body causes excruciating pain. The third degree of torture would be to sustain that for the length of a certain number of prayers. That was the timing device. The fourth degree allowed the torturer to bounce the victim, to lift them up and drop them, so that they would get even more weight and shock on their limbs. And the fifth degree of torture was to literally pull limb from socket. So, like if all of the torture stuff, which frankly I found irresistible, is it's in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the torture and burning at the stake chapter. So if this is too hard for you to take, you can skip it. But I have a feeling you won't. Yes, sir. I'll come to you next. Yes, sir.
Yes, in the modern war on terror, we have this conflation of the threat that Iraq supposedly presented, and then a more real threat. Is this common to the history of Inquisition to conflate one idea with another in order to justify a particular attack?
Well,
this is a common aspect.
This gets down to the real, where the rubber meets the road on any justification of these kinds of techniques. Standing in 2008 and looking back on the Cathars, it's impossible for the modern mind to look at the Cathars as an existential threat to Christendom. According to our value system, they were just premature Protestants. Okay? But in the eyes of the Pope, they were an intolerable threat, and so any means was justified to root them out. Now, as you move forward through history, you can stop at various points where an apparent threat was detected and measured and used to justify a technique that we would regard as outrageous. The next example I'll use is the internment of 120,000 Japanese American men, women, and children, wholly innocent, guilty only of having Japanese ancestry, dispossessed, imprisoned because of the fear that they would be a fifth column in service to Imperial Japan in a time of war. Were we really at war? Yes, we were. Was the threat real? No, it wasn't. There was not a single act of sabotage or espionage by a Japanese American during World War II. And in fact, famously, Japanese Americans volunteered to serve and fought bravely in the war effort. At the time and place where the internment order was given, it was defended, it was justified by the Supreme Court, upheld by the Supreme Court. So when we get to Iraq, we have a very similar example where we have men lying to us, men and women, lying to us about what kind of threat did Iraq pose. And you had otherwise, I guess, progressive politicians, Democrats in Congress, who said, well, I guess I'm obliged as a patriotic American to vote for this war because look at all the terrible things that might happen if we don't take Saddam Hussein out. In retrospect, it turns out that the intelligence was a lie. So we always have the benefit of knowledge when we look back at history, but we don't have that benefit when the decision is made. The Inquisition never faced anything in its long history that was a martial military threat of violence. They were only trying to destroy freedom of thought. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you a question about what you call the so-called War on Terror. But before I do that, you mentioned that the Inquisition asked the question whether a woman conceived by action of God or man. It reminds me of the last two lines of a limerick. It wasn't the Almighty that lifted her nighty. It was Roger the Lodger, by God. You can use that in your talk. You said earlier in your talk, you said, when you talked about different Holocausts, and you mentioned the so-called War on Terror. That puzzled me. I wonder what you meant. I wonder if you were thinking of the fact that Osama bin Laden has not been accused of 9/11 by the FBI, or that a lot of people believe that 9/11 was a false flag operation intended to falsely accuse Muslims. I don't know what's in your mind.
Well, when I say the war on terror, I'm talking about the whole complex of policies and actions of the United States government in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11, 2001. And those included all kinds of internal security measures in the United States, intelligence gathering, surveillance, arrest, detention, all justified by the government as necessary precautions to prevent another terrorist attack.
So you believe Muslims did it, right?
I mean, look, I have no question that the hijack, in my mind, I don't entertain any doubt that the hijackers who flew those planes into those buildings were Muslim fundamentalists who had been organized by other Muslim fundamentalists to do that. I don't impugn the entire Muslim world for the acts of the craziest fringe element, but I don't think that's, well, look, I'm not going.
You're misinformed, but that's okay.
Okay. In the very back there.
Talk to me about it.
Longest lasting user of these tools, longest lasting institution. But were they the most successful at using the tools, or would an organization like Stalin and Mao Zedong and the Stasi put them to shame?
It's an interesting question. Who has been the most successful user? Was it the Inquisition or someone else? One of the sources well, it's actually my favorite, Henry Charles Lay, said that if the Inquisition had been in working order in Germany, it had fallen into disuse in Germany, at the time of Luther, he would have been dispatched with alacrity, and the Protestant Reformation would have been stopped in its tracks. Well, you know, that's one of those great what-ifs of history. Obviously, the totalitarian system that the medieval Roman Catholic Church sought to impose was a failure, and the Inquisition did not ensure its success. It failed. It failed because the human spirit seeks diversity of expression and yearns for the freedom to explore choices. That's in our human nature. It had to fail, and no amount of repression sustained over any period of time would have worked, nor did it work. 600 years went by, and we still have the world in which we live today, which is not a religious, theocracy. Stalin failed too. He's not there anymore, and as disheveled and chaotic as the former Soviet Union is, the terror system of Stalin did not survive. Hitler survived the shortest of all. He was the worst in many ways by many measurements, but he only lasted a few years. I think in the end, these tools are not successful in the long run. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that some people sort of poo-poo the whole happening of the Spanish Inquisition. Let's all be in D'Souza, for example. They said it's just a few thousand, but there are clear records, you say. So what is your best estimate, and how accurate are those estimates of how many people were?
Well, how many real victims were there? In my book, I examine the historical evidence for the body counts. For example, one of the great examples is that the Witch Craze, the victims of the Witch Craze, and I want to point out, because you're going to be hearing from a scholar on the history of witchcraft, that witches tragically were persecuted by both the Inquisition and by the secular courts and the secular government. So if you were accused of witchcraft, you might end up in front of the Inquisitor and you might not. For a long time, the number 1 million was thrown around. There were 1 million women burned as witches. Modern scholarship says that's a grotesque over-exaggeration by a factor of 10, and probably the reliable historical number is 100,000. How many over 600 years of operation of the Inquisition, how many people were actually burned? We don't know. We simply don't know. It's probably a number measured in multiple tens of thousands, maybe in the aggregate of several 100,000. But it is impossible to ascertain for the reason I've already touched upon, which is that the records of the Inquisition, although detailed and meticulous, were not consistently preserved. So for example, Bernard Guy, one of the Grand Inquisitors, kept good records, and we have his records. We know how many people he arrested, how many went to prison, how many were sentenced to wear heretics' crosses, how many were sentenced to go on pilgrimage, how many were actually burned, how many living heretics were burned, how many defunct heretics were burned. And it's in my book. I mean, you can see the numbers. And if you extrapolated from his numbers, you would come up with a death count, but it would be a speculative number. Yes, sir?
Yes, sir. Laurentius, one of the last of the Inquisitioners, in his very famous book, in the last chapter says that 300,000 alone in Spain. Is that true, or is that exactly?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Laurentio, as the gentleman has correctly pointed out, was one of the late officials of the Inquisition, and he absconded with the records of the Inquisition when Napoleon invaded Spain and took them to Paris and was commissioned to do an official history. So it was quite an authoritative history from one point of view. This was a man who was a bureaucrat in the Spanish Inquisition in its last days, and he had access to what remained of the records. And so you'd have to give some credence to his numbers, but it's hard to know. No, several 100,000 seems plausible, but I'll give you another example. Henry Camins, a very noted scholar of the Spanish Inquisition, crunched the numbers on how many Jews there were in Spain at the time of the expulsion and how many stayed and how many left. And he feels that those numbers, the gross numbers, what was the starting population of Jews when the expulsion took place and how many were left, how many fell under the jurisdiction of the Spanish Inquisition. He thinks those numbers were grotesquely inflated by conventional history, and that actually the numbers were much smaller. We may never get good answers to those questions. Yes, sir?
Generally, you would think at those times the population was far smaller as well. So those numbers could represent quite a large percentage of the population.
It's true that we have to measure both the actual numbers when compared to the reputed numbers, and we need to put the numbers into some historical context. But I would caution you that there's a danger in playing the numbers game, because what was indisputably true is that this institution existed, it operated, it had real effects on real lives, and in fact it had much greater effects, distorting effects on commerce, on technology. You know, there's a school of history that says it's no accident that Northern and Western Europe was the seat of the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, because, as Henry Lee puts it, the dead hand of the Inquisition rested on Spain and Italy and Southern Europe. So regardless of the absolute number of victims, the effect of this 6 centuries of repression on real lives and on history is measurable. Yes.
You stated that the Inquisition ended in 1833?
1834 was...
1834, but I disagree. I went to school with the Jesuits in the 1950s. I can assure you, the Inquisition was alive.
Yes, sir.
My question is the relationship of the Jesuits to the Inquisition. Could you explain that more?
Well, I'll come to you in a minute. The orders of the Roman Catholic Church who were charged with the real heavy lifting of the Inquisition, starting in the 13th century, were the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Dominicans were known by the punning name Domine Canes, the hounds of the Lord. And they were the Inquisition. They were the inquisitors. The Jesuits come along a couple of centuries later. They're really the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. They come into existence in response to the threat of Protestantism, and they are allied with this institution of the Inquisition, which has remained in existence and plays a very important role in the Church's response to the Reformation. But they never operated the equipment of the Inquisition. Yes?
This is more like from, like, say, 18th century on, how as the Church ceased to be the single sort of controlling entity that influenced secular governments, as the press came into being with print, and now into, you know, the age of information, where you have dissemination. How do you, you know, because you're a writer, how do you perceive the influence of conformity of thought, of orthodoxy of thought in a culture war that's the extension of the Inquisition using modern media?
Well, there's no question that as the availability of printed material spread, as literacy increased, as the printing press came into common use, the ability of any authoritarian regime like the Inquisition to enforce its will on great populations was diminished. I mean, it's just for the same reason, but on a different scale, that it's no longer possible to exert information control in the digital age in a way that might have been plausible in an earlier age. Once the printing press was available, it was no longer possible to exert control in the 15th century in the way it might have been possible to do in the 13th century. So there's a constant decline in the effectiveness of the Inquisition to impose a dogma on the world around it. And I also want to make the point that we can't be too Western-centric, because the Inquisition operated only in Europe and the European colonies that were under the direct authority of the Roman Catholic Church. There was no Inquisition in the Eastern Orthodox world, and as the Inquisition receded, it was wholly absent from England. It was never in operation in England, and it began to be less significant in Northern Europe and eventually completely absent. I'm going to go to the very back on there.
Did the Protestants do anything similar?
The way I would answer your question is, and I've said this already today, what makes the Inquisition such a formidable phenomenon is this fusing of the power of church and the power of state. This is a very important point in understanding how the Inquisition operated. The defenders and apologists for the Inquisition always like to say the Inquisition never killed anybody, ever. It declared someone to be a heretic, and then it abandoned that person to the tender mercies of the secular government. The torturer in the torture chamber was the public torturer, the secular government. The executioner was the public executioner. But this is just window dressing. This is hypocrisy. There was an absolute certainty that the Inquisition would have its will done by the government, because at that point, at that time and place, there was an alliance between secular government and the church. That's a prerequisite for an Inquisition. If you have a church that lacks access to the instruments of police power, of prisons, of executioners, they can't impose that kind of will. In Protestant countries, by the time of the Protestant Reformation, although there were state churches, England had a state church, the relationship between church and state was much more attenuated. Now there were, to be sure, there were Catholic martyrs who died at the hands of Protestant monarchies, but not under the circumstances that could be compared to the Inquisition. Much more on an ad hoc basis. Yes, sir.
And it's your impression that the term war on terror is a deceptive metaphor?
I've been asked, is it my opinion that the word war on terror is a deceptive metaphor? And I say yes, in my feeling, it is a deceptive metaphor. It's a metaphor designed to misdirect our attention and to attribute to a vague, imprecise threat all kinds of abuses of our civil liberties. Yes, sir.
What was the impact, if any, of the plague on the Inquisition?
Well, there were times, the plague had its impact in highly localized areas. There were communities ravaged by the plague, other communities lightly touched, yet other communities not affected at all. And so in any given locality, there might be an argument that could be made that the tenor of the times, the perceptions of threat would make a local population more compliant or less compliant. But I didn't find anything in my research that would allow you to generalize about that, some clear linkage, cause and effect relationship between the Black Death and the Inquisition. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that England did not have an Inquisition.
Yes.
Well, when Henry VIII decided to depart from the Catholic Church because he wanted a son, then thereafter, of course, when that son that he then got died, his daughter, Bloody Mary, as she's known in England, had as good as an Inquisition. As you mentioned earlier, burnt an awful lot of Protestants, including Cranmer, at the stake. So I think actually it was a mindset of the times that has not totally, certainly in the 16th century, torture was a normal way of finding out the truth. And I think it was just a mindset of the times.
Well, first of all, let me make a distinction between my use of the word the Inquisition and a generic term, an Inquisition. And by the way, historians debate about that too. I discuss in my book one historical revisionist and frankly apologist who says that it's improper to use the capital I and refer to the Inquisition with a capital I, that no such thing ever existed, that there were only a lot of little inquisitions going on all over the place. I'm not persuaded by that. I use capital I in my book, as do most of my sources. And the Inquisition, as an office and an operation of the Roman Catholic Church, is a thing, and that thing did not operate in England. An Inquisition with a little I, in the sense that there was a system of state terror allied with a state church directed against a particular religious community, that could apply to certain periods of time in English history. But it's kind of a refreshing thought for those of us who look on the capital I Inquisition as a horror, that it did not successfully manage to reach the British Isles and was turned away. I think that's something the English should be very proud of. Yes.
How concerned are you that the policy of the average rate will be turned against us? I mean, some people argue that that's already happened, but the denial of civil liberties, denial of courts.
Against us, meaning as civilians?
Yeah, as Americans. Not that that's excusable that they do it to quote-unquote enemy combatants, but I mean, how are you concerned that they will eventually be successful in turning that against the so-called political dissidents, people who call themselves Democrats or whatever?
Well, look, if you're, this is a glass half empty, glass half full kind of question. I happen to believe that the American democracy is sturdy enough that we will resist these fears and panics, and we will fight against government abuse, and we have evidence that that's been true. Even during periods of excess, there's been a reaction to that. I hope that that's true, and I believe that that's true. But I'm enough of a skeptic to entertain.